Well, welcome back to a new video. So in this lecture series, we're going to be looking at the lymphatic system. Okay, so take a second before we start and just kind of think a little bit about what is going to be involved with the lymphatic system, if you know anything about it, and what other system is somewhat related to it in the sense that some of the features of this system, the lymphatic system, will also be present in this other system as well. So we'll hop in and we'll get started, and along the way we'll introduce that other system a little bit and talk about it in just a little bit of detail, and then we'll have a whole nother lecture on that. So when you think about the lymphatic system, you can break the lymphatic system down into different components, if you will. You have your general lymph fluid, which we'll talk about how we get that, and then the flow of that fluid through our lymphatic vessels. Okay, so just like blood, so arterial blood or venous blood, which flows through arteries and veins, our lymph is going to flow through lymphatic vessels. And we'll look at the structure of a lymphatic vessel and see how in some respects it's somewhat similar to our veins. Okay, we have our lymph nodes, and so lymph nodes are it's probably a term that is somewhat familiar to you. You may have had your lymph nodes, checked at a doctor's visit. You may have swollen and enlarged lymph nodes depending on some type of immune process that may be occurring. And then we have lymphatic organs, so actual organs that are going to be designated to this lymphatic system and to the protecting of our body. So we have the thymus, which we saw a little bit with the, what you pointed out with the endocrine system, and then the spleen as well. So the spleen is going to be a somewhat large organ located in the left upper quadrant of our abdomen, and we'll see how it participates in the immune system and the lymphatic system. So here we have a generic overview of some of the lymphatic components that we're going to look at. So primarily you see lymph nodes. So throughout the body, there are lymph nodes really all throughout the body, head, thorax, abdomen, as well as the upper and lower limbs. But they seem to be somewhat clustered and somewhat aggregated in specific regions. So when you look at this, what regions do you see lymph nodes being primarily located, or kind of an aggregation of lymph nodes? Hopefully you see quite a few here in this inguinal region. So this inguinal region here, as well as this pelvic region. You see quite a few in the axillary region, and then several up in the head and neck area, so this cervical region as well. So these are three common locations for aggregations of lymph nodes, but keep in mind that they're really present kind of all throughout the body. As we get to lymph nodes, we'll talk about their structure and how they function in our lymphatic system to filter lymph and filter out any pathogens that may be present. So the lymphatic system and our cardiovascular system are going to be closely related. So I mentioned just a few seconds ago that about how we get our lymphatic fluid. So how do we get that? Well, if you think back to our cardiovascular system lecture with blood vessels, we had to filter out our blood, or not necessarily filter out, but we had to filter some of the contents out in the sense that we had to participate in exchange of gases and nutrients at the tissue level. We had some blood leave, some fluid leave the cell and go out into the interstitium, the interstitial space. Some of that blood was reabsorbed. Some of that fluid was reabsorbed. Some of it was not reabsorbed into the circulatory system, but was rather absorbed into this lymphatic system, so into the lymphatic vessels, those lymphatic capillaries. Okay, so that's the interplay between the lymphatic system and the cardiovascular system. It's reabsorbing excess fluid that remains in the interstitial space that is coming from the cardiovascular system. Okay. Now, we also have small lymphatic capillaries in parts of our digestive tract that are called lacteals, and we'll see lacteals come up Here we'll see them come up with the digestive system. We'll see them come up with nutrient and metabolism as well. But what it is, it's a small single structure, a small single capillary that extends up in the villi or the villus. When we get to the digestive system, we'll talk about what that is. But this little finger-like projection of our digestive tract, this lymphatic capillary extends up into it, and it's going to be primarily responsible for aiding in the absorption of fats and lipids and different fat-soluble materials that we're getting from our digestive tract, so that we ingest. They'll be absorbed into this lacteal, this little small lymphatic capillary. And then lastly, we also have our lymphatic system filter our lymph, so through our lymph nodes, that will help to ultimately get rid and destroy any pathogens that may be present. So this is why in times of an infection, you will see your lymph nodes swell. There's increased fluid there, increased lymphatic fluid that is participating in this filtering process, and this is a protective feature. So we'll start here and we'll talk a little bit about lymphatic fluid and the flow of that fluid in our lymphatic vessels. So our lymph flow is really just going to be that interstitial fluid that has now, it's left our cardiovascular system, went to the interstitial space, and now has absorbed into our lymphatic vessels, and it's going to be flowing. So we have about 3 liters a day that is circulated in our lymphatic vessels, and you can compare this to blood, which we have on the order of 5 liters. So we have more blood being circulated than we do lymph, but keep in mind that lymph is ultimately coming from that blood. It's that bit which is filtered out and then is reabsorbed into the lymphatic system. So it's not blood. Interstitial fluid is not blood, but it's basically the lymphatic fluid is not blood, but it's basically the plasma component of blood minus lots of different proteins. Now, our lymph fluid is going to travel in a very similar manner to how our venous blood traveled in our veins. So if you think back to how the venous blood traveled in the veins, how did it travel? Well, it traveled largely due to us moving. It traveled due to body movements, muscle contractions, as well as the presence of valves. Remember, valves were present in our veins to help prevent backflow of blood. Well, it turns out that valves are also going to be present in our lymphatic vessels as well, and they're going to serve a very similar, basically the same function. Okay, so here on the left image, what is zoomed in here, you can see a lymphatic vessel with a valve. So remember, it's just that infolding of that internal layer here, and lymph fluid in this case is going to be flowing upward, and these valves will help prevent the backflow. And then on the right image is a strange looking image, isn't it? It's a picture of a drawing of a person that has this very unique color distribution. So what you see is on this person's left side and most of their lower abdominal region, as well as all their lower limb and left side of their head, it's all yellow. And then the right side of their head, the right side of their thorax and abdomen, and their whole right arm, that's all purple. So that's showing the pattern of distribution of 2 different ducts and the areas in which they drain lymphatic fluid from the body. So the patient's left side, that which is in yellow in the lower limb, that's going to all be the thoracic duct. And then we'll have the right side of the head, right thorax and abdomen, and the right upper limb, which will be the right lymphatic duct. And those are just large lymphatic structures, large lymphatic vessels that participate in draining and ultimately returning that lymphatic fluid back into the blood. So what you can see here, we'll learn about these blood vessels, but this is the junction of the internal jugular and the subclavian vein at the brachiocephalic vein, and those ducts drain into it here on the right side, as well as here on the left side as well. So we'll get back to these ducts and the manner in which they drain lymph from the body. So we'll jump now into specific lymphatic vessels and how they are draining lymph from different parts of the body. So our lymphatic vessels are going to be running generally alongside our arteries and veins, but they're not going to be in every single location throughout the body. Okay, so we typically don't have them in bone marrow, teeth, bone in general, as well as our nervous system, our central nervous system. So there is no lymphatic flow. There is no lymphatic availability in these different areas. You still have arteries supplying arterial blood and veins supplying venous blood, or draining venous blood rather, but there is no lymphatic supply here. We have the lymphatic capillaries that we talked about. They're the smallest vessel, just like the normal capillaries in our cardiovascular system. They're very porous, so they're able to absorb and bring in lots of fluid from the surrounding areas. And they have a specialized structure that allows them to bring fluid in, bring in lymphatic fluid, but not allow it to escape very easy. And we'll see that there's these little flaps that are overlapped, and it's essentially a one-way valve. So lymph will flow into that vessel, pushing open the valve, enter the lumen of the vessel, lumen of the capillary, and it's not able to leave. So what you can see in this image, and I'll show another image as well that's zoomed up on the side, you can see these little flaps. So lymph will flow in here, and as it flows into this vessel, it's unable to exit out the same way in which it came. So these flaps allow things to come in, and these collagen fibers help to pull open these flaps and separate these cells to really allow increased fluid to enter this vessel. But note the arrangement of the vessels to the cells around them. So you see lymphatic vessel all in here, and then you can see tissue cells all throughout here, this more tan structure with this central kind of brown-orange nucleus. All this blue space out here to the side, that's all the interstitial space with interstitial fluid. So that's the fluid that has been filtered out. And then this fluid, ultimately, some of it will be reabsorbed into the blood, but some of it will enter into this lymphatic vessel. And now here it was interstitial fluid. Now we're calling it lymph or lymphatic fluid. But it's basically the same thing. It has just gone from the interstitial space through the flap in our lymphatic vessel and into the lumen of the vessel. Note, let me go back one second. Note how the lymphatic vessels here are closely related and closely intertwined with the blood capillaries. And this is important because this is where the fluid is coming from. Remember we said that that fluid is being filtered out of the blood. Some of it ends up in this interstitial space and then comes into the vessel. So note this relationship, this important relationship between the lymphatic vessels and the arterial and venous capillaries here. So here's another representation of the flap, that endothelial flap in our lymphatic vessel. So you have this structure here. This would be somewhat movable and malleable. So fluid could come in, push on this flap, and enter into this vessel. But when it comes up this way, it's not able to open up the flap to exit. So it's really a one-way valve that's helping prevent fluid from leaving. And then remember, you'll have those valves within the vessel that keeps fluid moving in a single direction, ultimately back toward the heart. So here you can see a lymphatic vessel, and if you look closely, you can see a darkened region here on the left, and you can see some others in different locations as well. But this is the valve. So this is the lymphatic valve in our lymphatic vessel. And so if you think about what the valves did in the venous blood, in our veins, what did the valves do there? Well, hopefully you're thinking or you're saying that it prevented blood from flowing retrogradely or flowing backwards away from the heart. Well, the valves here in our lymphatic vessels, they're going to do the exact same thing. So in this instance, fluid may be flowing upward in this upward direction, and if it tried to flow retrogradely backwards, these valves would be opposed to each other, they'd be pushed together, and that would prevent the backflow of lymphatic fluid within our lymphatic vessel. You can also see another one here, just a more zoomed in picture, and you can see one leaflet on this side, one on this side, and again, fluid is going to be traveling up through this valve, and it will be flowing toward the heart and from going into backflow due to the presence of these valves. So the lacteal, I alluded to the lacteal earlier, and what it is it's this small lymphatic capillary that we said was in a villus. So villus is singular, villi is plural, and they're these little finger-like projections that are present within the small intestine. So what they look like is they look like these large finger-like projections that kind of look like this. Okay, and let me go back. And what they have in the middle of them, they have a small lymphatic capillary that's going to run up in the middle just like this. So it will come up and then come back down and then come over. And it's this small lymphatic capillary that is going to be participating in absorbing our lipids and our fat-soluble materials. And when it combines in here, when the lipids or the fat-soluble materials combine with the lymphatic fluid that we already talked about, when it enters into this structure here, we're going to call it chyle. Okay, so not chyle like the name the person, but chyle as in C-H-Y-L-E. And what it is, it's really a kind of a white, milky white fluid that will then be present within this lacteal. And it's because of this mixture of lipids and the already present lymphatic fluid. So what you can see here is you can see exactly that. You can see these large villi up here, and then you can see that single lacteal that runs up through the middle of this villi, and it would be helping to absorb any lipids that were in our intestine. We'll see this same picture again when we get to the digestive system. We'll talk about really what the villi are for. And then on top of these villi, you have individual cells and you have microvilli. But this is a very strong digestive system lecture topic. And so we'll bypass that for now. But when we get to the digestive system lecture, we will definitely talk about that. So here's the same thing again. This is the whole villus, this large structure here. And in the middle, you can kind of see this lighter, more porous structure. That's going to be the lacteal that extends up. Nutrients would be absorbed through these cells and then ultimately into the lacteal and be circulating in our lymphatic system until they can be processed and stored. So we have a hierarchy of lymphatic vessels. So just like the arteries and veins, remember we had larger arteries and then we had more smaller distributing arteries, and then we had arterioles, and then got all the way down to metarterioles and capillaries. Well, we have a similar type of hierarchy with our lymphatic vessels. So we started with capillaries, right? Multiple capillary beds are going to merge and form a single vessel or a collecting vessel. And these have those same three layers that we talked about with arteries and veins. So the tunica interna being the innermost, the tunica media being the middle, and then the tunica externa being the most superficial, but they're not as clear and distinct as you see in arteries and veins, but they're still there. And then, like we said, these vessels are always also going to contain valves to help prevent backflow of lymphatic fluid. Now, when we have multiple vessels, these are going to merge to form something called a lymphatic trunk. Okay, so there are lots of different lymphatic trunks, but we're going to focus on the lumbar, the bronchomediastinal, subclavian, and jugular. And we'll see there's also intestinal trunks. We'll see the intestinal trunks and our lumbar trunk come together, and they're going to form a really large kind of lymphatic sac-like vessel, and we'll look at that in just a bit. So here you can see a lymphatic duct. You can see a right lumbar trunk. You can see a left lumbar trunk, an intestinal trunk. And so this is what I was saying. You have a left lumbar trunk, you have a right lumbar trunk, and you have an intestinal trunk. So if you see, you have 1, 2, and 3. These three merge to form this kind of large sac-like structure. So hopefully you can see it here where my pointer is, and you can see it over on the left, very slightly kind of down here near the aorta. And what this is called is it's called the cisterna chyli. And it's really this large sac-like structure of a lymphatic vessel that is going to ultimately merge and become our thoracic duct, traveling up toward the junction of our left jugular, internal jugular, and our left subclavian. But what it is, it's just this large mass that forms from the union of our right and left lumbar trunks, as well as our more midline intestinal trunk. So our lymphatic ducts, we just mentioned those. So if you look back here, you see a right lymphatic duct, and then you see a thoracic duct. And these are going to be the largest point in our hierarchy of lymphatic vessels. And this is what is going to have a strange pattern of distribution and a strange drainage distribution. So the right lymphatic duct drains a little bit of the right side of the head, right part of the thorax and abdomen, as well as all of the right limb. And then the thoracic duct drains everything else. So that's a good way you can go about learning these. Learn one of them. So maybe learn what the thoracic duct drains. So it drains the left side of the face and head, left side of the thorax and abdomen, all of the left upper limb, and then all of the lower limb. So if you know that, the right lymphatic duct is just going to drain everything else. You could also learn it vice versa. Learn what the right lymphatic duct drains, and then the thoracic duct just drains everything else. Breaking it down like that, I think it's really going to help you understand this a little bit better, and it's going to make it easier for you to remember, because really you only need to pick one, learn that one, and then you know the other one, you know it essentially by default. Okay, so here's that pattern of distribution. So we can see our cisterna merging and becoming our thoracic duct, and all of this yellow region is what is drained by our thoracic duct. So the majority of the lymph in our the lymph in our body, is going to be ultimately drained into the thoracic duct, drained by the thoracic duct, and then our right lymphatic duct is going to drain a smaller portion of our body. So our right upper limb, right thorax and part of our abdomen, and then the right side of the head. But note that they both merge and join into the junction of the internal jugular and subclavian veins. So right here at this brachiocephalic trunk. The right one here and the left one here. So they're merging at the same place, just on opposite sides of the body. So you can see that where it's zoomed in here in this midline picture. So we're going to stop there for part one, and then we'll pick up shortly with part two.